Lovely to be with you. Thank you very much for having me. I am very excited about this. I love this book, and I just think it's an amazing thing to have the revelation. It introduces itself as the revelation of Jesus Christ. So not primarily the revelation of the future, or the revelation of the new world, or the revelation of the timelines, or the revelation of where Donald Trump fits into all this, or any of that stuff. It actually says it is relevant to those things, but it says it's the revelation of Jesus, which is a really beautiful way to start. Just helps us find our feet. And so what I hope you have been sent, or you got an email form, I think. You should have been sent a sort of handout, but that has, some of you got it in paper, some have got it on screens, some have got it in more than one place, very efficient. If you don't have it, I'm going to put slides up here. So we just put up slide number 1, which is just a sort of an overview slide of where we're going to go. It doesn't look quite like this. There's no John writing on it. There we go. It looks rather more prosaic and PowerPointy. So sorry about that. But we're going to have to, we've got a lot. I told a friend of mine, and they said, what are you doing in Christchurch? He said, I'm teaching Revelation in 4.5 hours. And they just laughed in my face. They're like, that's an absolutely ridiculous attempt. And it does mean we're going to have to keep moving. But I love questions and discussion. And one of the reasons why it's all set up like this, so we can sit on tables, is because I'll be throwing questions to you and have discussion and that. But obviously at times we may have to move on from a question because there's just no space for everything. I'll be around through the breaks and lunch and that sort of thing, hopefully be able to chat with people who've got sort of outstanding questions and things if it would help. But this is roughly how we're going to structure the day. So session 1 is going to be really an overview. And in some ways you have to do, this is the hardest, but in some ways the most important bit at the very beginning. It's not theologically the most important bit, but it's the most important bit for grasping how the whole book works, because this is where I'm going to try and talk about what kind of a book Revelation is, how it fits together, what John's trying to do. And then we'll look at, really, as we'll see in a moment, I'll try and explain why I think the best way of structuring the book is according to the 4 visions that John says he has when he says, I was in the Spirit and I saw. So he does that 4 times. He uses this phrase, in the Spirit, I saw. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's day and behold, that kind of thing. And that's in a way his structure, the way that he tells us. I had this vision, which lasted 3 chapters, and then I had another vision, which lasted another 13 chapters, and then I had another one, and then I had another one. And that's the way we're going to try and shape today. So the first session is an overview. The second session, we'll look at the vision he has in the Spirit on Patmos. And then we will start on the second, because the second vision is the longest, so we need more time. The second vision is the one with all of the, trumpets and bowls and seals and flying frogs and locust scorpions and lions that look like hippos and all sorts of things like this, which will be tricky. But that's the bit people generally think of with the book. But as we'll see, I think it's to misread the book if we then go, let's zero in on that and try and work out what all the symbols are. We have to do that, but that's not central. And once we understand the first vision, we'll understand the second, I hope. And then we'll look towards the afternoon. We'll look at the third vision in the Spirit in the wilderness. And then finally, this glorious vision, really ultimately of the church and the new creation from the mountain. And so I'll try and explain to you why we're going to do that as we go. But I want to start, next one, Justin. I'm going to sound like Chris Whitty at times today, so sorry about that. Next slide, please. Gosh, this has come out looking different. But that's okay. You've reformatted it for me. Thank you. Is that to make it more readable? Excellent. Okay. So there are 4 interpretive frameworks. So that as I said, we're going to jump in deep, and some of you have lectured on this book, and others of you have read it, or maybe not that. So I know that this will be a bit of a deep dive, but I want to start by introducing 4 bits of jargon, not because we're going to spend the day talking about the jargon, but because actually at the foundation of Revelation, if you begin to read it and you get 2 different people read it with totally different expectations of what they think they will find. And as a result, they can be talking at cross purposes all day about what it means. And these 4 words are just kind of one-word summaries of entire schools of thought as to what kind of book this is. Top left, the first one, no particular order, idealist. The idealist framework, which is basically the imagery and the metaphor in Revelation denotes timeless spiritual truths which recur again and again throughout human history. So if you read about a beast or a number or an angel coming in with hair like this, bringing down fire and thunder upon something else, you're not expecting necessarily that to relate to one person in history. You are expecting that to be a symbolic, metaphorical representation of the way that evil works throughout human history. And that school of thought will mean you'll read the book in a particular way and has some strengths. It's very transferable. So any generation can read Revelation and say, this speaks to me. Because there's always powers of evil, there's always powers of good, there's always a battle between good and evil, the kingdom's always going forth. So it's got lots of strengths. It's not that weird because you're going, the symbols mean these other things. The weaknesses can be that because it's very, free and can be applied to anything, people say, well, it's not very clear. It's a bit could mean anything. So that symbol could be this person, it could also be that. It could be Nero, it could be Donald Trump, it could be the Pope. What are we to do with all of these symbols? That's the weakness. It can be a little bit what exactly is it saying? That's where it said I think it's weakness, that reading. And also that the promise, I'm coming soon, loses its impact. Because you think, well, how soon is soon? We've been here 2,000 years. What's going on? That kind of thing, right? So that's the idealist reading. Hi, Mick. Nice to see you. Oh, hi. Yeah. Anyway, sorry, just friends coming in. It's lovely. Let's move across. The preterist reading, which is almost the opposite end of the spectrum. And the preterist reading is effectively that the main focus of the book of Revelation and the focus of almost all of the passages is actually on the events that are contemporary to the people who read the book in the first century. That actually the symbols relate to very concrete events taking place, most of them in the first century themselves, like the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, or maybe the eventual destiny of the Roman Empire that they lived under. So the fall of Rome may be the outer marker of how the focal point of this book. But it's basically the symbols relate to things that happened in the first century. And so if you had a full-on preterist reading, you would say everything in this book is not describing anything to do with the 2100s or 2000s. It's just not where we are in the book. We are dealing with first century events, first century people. The people who read it knew that. It was a letter to actual churches in Turkey, what we now call Turkey, and it was telling them what these events meant. And you and I need to know that before we read the book and understand. Otherwise, we'll start going, well, I think that symbol relates to this political figure in my day. You're like, no. That's not how the book works. They would say, no, this is first century people. It's almost entirely about Rome and Jerusalem. And you need to know that before you start reading it, right? Now, you can see, I guess, that you might take both of those readings together. And spoiler alert, I do. I have mishmashed those two. That's how I read the book, and that's what I'm going to do today. You may not, so you may have been taught it a very different way, but that's where I'm coming from. So they're not separate. But obviously, if you read it in either or both of those ways, you will come up with a very different meaning to, for instance, the trumpets and the bowls and the seals, than if you read it in one of the bottom two ways, in which you're expecting a much greater degree of sequencing and linearity and predictive power to the events it's describing. So, bottom left, the futurist view would say the text is focusing on the events leading up to the end of all things and the return of Christ in the future. So it is to do with what, where, and when. And so it's telling you, this is really this is told in sequence, and most of the book, maybe not the beginning 3 chapters, but most of the book is talking about things that are going to happen as history accelerates up to the return of Jesus. So all of it is pretty much still in the future, with the probable exception of chapters 1 to 3. Strengths of that view is literal, it's predictive, it's in sequence, and it's transferable. All subsequent readers can go, that was what will happen one day. It's hopeful, because you know what's going to happen. The weaknesses are that the timelines then become very difficult to sequence if you've ever studied this stuff and you start trying to work out, so hang on, is it one, this one then, and then there, so the 7th trumpet goes there, and then the bowls are coming, and it becomes a bit of a muddle. And when you see the number of timelines there are available online, you'll realize there is no clarity. That doesn't actually necessarily clarify for you what happens when, but it's all there. But so that's a possible weakness. And also the thing about soon is a weakness as well, because John seems to be very comforted and wants to comfort people by the soonness of the events he's describing. But if it's all in the future and it still hasn't happened now, then the last 50 generations of the church haven't got much to hold on to, or at least, soon, but not in your lifetime or your great-grandchildren's great-grandchildren's lifetimes. So there's some challenges with that one. And then the historicist reading is basically, this is where the timeline people really go to town, is this maps the history of the church, all of it, not just the end, not just the beginning. So if you like, the preterists are saying this relates just to the start, the first 100 years. The futurists say this relates to the last few generations before the return of Christ. The idealists say it relates to all of it in symbolic language. And the historicists say, no, it tells you the story of the whole sequence. And you get people literally, you've got lots of these things online. This section relates to up until the fall of Rome. That section relates to medieval Europe. That section's the Reformation. That's the French Revolution. Like, you've got lots of this stuff online. And it tells you the whole narrative. So the strengths of that, it's literal, it's predictive, it's transferable to everybody, it's reassuring because you know where you are here and this is what will happen. The weaknesses are it can be an indecipherable mess, as in whether you think that chapter refers to this event or that event kind of depends on when you live. Everybody thinks that this dramatic enemy is in their day. You know what I mean? No one's now going, oh, I think that must be Tamburlaine. Because everyone's like, Tamburlaine's not a relevant threat to you. And people now go, it's the Ayatollah or something. And you think, yeah, but in 1,000 years' time, people will think that sounds ridiculous as well. It's kind of, that's the bit that gets tricky there. And it can get very confusing. And it's very hard to see why it would have been comforting to people in the first century. So there's 4 different readings. I've tried to give strengths and weaknesses to each of them. What I do, as I say, is I'm a mashup of idealist and preterist. I think the book is a letter written to people in the first century. And if we don't realize that, we don't think this had to make sense to Sextus, the slave, living in a household in Laodicea in the AD 60s. And if it doesn't make sense to Sextus, and most of it is utterly impenetrable to him, then it's probably not what the book meant, because that's who it's written for. That's where I'm coming from. So in that sense, I am preterist, but I'm also idealist because I think it isn't only written for him, it's written for all the subsequent generations of the church. And these symbols don't only describe the way that the Roman Empire works, they also describe the way that pagan worldly empire in general works in its opposition to Christ. So that's where I'm coming from. You don't have to buy that. But at least for the next few hours, it will probably help you if you kind of see why I say it anyway. And I'll show you that, hopefully, on the next page. So this is how John describes his own book, okay? Sorry, font size. I know some of you got better glasses than others. This is just, I didn't know how big the screen was going to be. So if you, hopefully, that's why you got the handout. So in the opening 9 verses, John gives switches genre quite a lot, as in the type of writing he says he's using changes a lot, even in the opening few verses. The revelation of Jesus Christ, the apocalypsis is the Greek word there. It's the unveiling is what it literally means. It's the peeling back of the curtain. It's like, there isn't a curtain here, but often you get these sort of things where you're on a stage and there's a curtain, and then you peel back the curtain and you can see, oh, look what's going on behind the scenes. That's what Revelation is claiming to be. It's the unveiling, but not just the unveiling of things, of history, but the unveiling of Jesus. So that all of the things you see in this world are having the veil peeled back from them so you can see Christ and his kingdom and his purposes working out through them. And so when you read, as we have done the last few weeks, I imagine, every day, if you're like me, you check the BBC website and you're thinking, I honestly wonder what has happened overnight. Have we invaded? Is there another country that's suddenly on the table now? It's like Greenland, Venezuela, Iran. And I don't understand how to make sense of all of these things that are happening. And it's like Revelation say, okay, we'll just pause judgment on some of those. Let's just peel back the curtain and see the heavenly realities behind the earthly ones that you can see. Let's see Christ's kingdom and his exaltation and his purposes and the people and the powers that hate him and are trying to destroy him, and how ultimately he overcomes them, and how the church has an enormous role to play in that, and our witness and ministry. Let's peel back the curtain and see those heavenly realities. That's what John says at the very start, the apocalypse of Jesus Christ. So Revelation is an apocalypse. It's a revelation from God which takes back the curtain on the world and shows us what's happening behind it. But then it switches from there to a benediction. Blessed is the one, I love this because it's a big part of my role in life is to read aloud the words of Scripture and talk about them. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it. So you're blessed just for being here and hearing these words read today. Even if I don't say, maybe I'll just do that. Just read the book from beginning to end. It would bless all of us. Right? So it's a benediction. And it also notice it refers to it as a prophecy, which we'll come back to in a minute. Then verse 4, John, to the 7 churches that are in Asia, grace to you and peace. So this also purports to be a letter. And the reason why the book can be confusing is because we are then trying to kind of integrate the fact that John says it is an apocalypse, an unveiling, which is, we don't really use this kind of writing anymore in the West, but they did a lot in the first century Jewish world. So it's an apocalypse, an unveiling, but it's also a letter. And you and I think we know how to read letters because we've got lots of them in the New Testament. But what you have to do is you have to read it both as letter and as apocalypse. And the apocalypse, if you think about the previous page, the apocalypse idea lends itself to the idealist reading. That is, these symbols refer to timeless realities. But the letterness of Revelation lends itself to a preterist reading. As in, this is for particular people, Sextus the slave in their household in Laodicea in AD 61, and it's got to make sense to him. Otherwise, what on earth is, he's not writing initially. He's writing, the whole Bible is written for us, but it's not written to us. And that's just an important principle of all books. So you and I, he's not writing for Mornay. Ultimately, Mornay's God knows, Mornay's going to read it and he's got to understand it. But that's not the audience that John is initially, he's thinking, who am I thinking of? And so the letter means we're going to read it more like preterists because it is an epistle to a specific group of believers who have specific challenges in the first century. And even challenges that they might not have had if they lived even a few hundred miles away from where they do. So it's very, just like we would read all other letters like that. You don't read the letter to the Corinthians and assume the backdrop of the letter to the Romans. It just wouldn't make sense. And that's what we have to do with this as well. Then there's a doxology to him who loves us and has freed us from our sins by his blood and made us a kingdom and priests to his God and Father. To him be glory and dominion forever. So there's a burst forth in worship. Then it switches back to apocalypse. Behold, he's coming with the clouds and every eye will see him, which we've already sung. Then it says, now there's a prophetic message here as well. I am the Alpha and the Omega, says the Lord God. So now God is speaking in prophetic form through the voice of the text. And then it goes back to epistle. I, John, your brother and partner in the tribulation and the kingdom, was on the Lord's day, and so on. In other words, even in the introductory 9 verses, we have a number of switches of literary style and form which show us that what John is doing is an unusual mixture of apocalypse, letter, and prophecy. And we have to read it with those different pairs of lenses on, otherwise we will misunderstand it. So that's how John introduced. Now, I'm not saying, therefore, John proves that the framework I use is correct and everything you're about to hear is true. It's not that. We've got to admit that on some things we've got to be more open-handed and more, I think it's this, but I don't know. But I'll try and hedge what I'm saying appropriately. So if I'm not sure, I'll say I'm not sure. If I'm like, I think there's pretty strong consensus that this is right, then I'll say that. But I do think this one shows we are dealing with all 3 of those kinds of writings all at once. Let me just pause for a second. Is there anybody, have I used any terminology or jargon I have not explained that means that people are sitting there going, to be honest, you just keep using that word and I've got no idea what you're on about, so it would help me if you could just tell me what you're saying. So any questions, any clarification questions at this point? What do I mean by apocalypse? Unveiling, right? Pulling back the curtain. Eugene Peterson has this lovely image. If you don't like the curtain image, I like the backstage, showing what's going on behind the scenes. But Eugene Peterson has a lovely image of it in his book, Reversed Thunder on Revelation, where he says you come into the kitchen and you can smell this beautiful smell of some kind of stew is bubbling, but it's in a crock pot and you can't tell what it is. Or we use a slow cooker. And sometimes I just can't tell what it is. I know it's got some spice and some intrigue, but I don't know what it is. And then you go over to the slow cooker and you lift the lid and it's like apocalypse. Now I can see, that's what Eugene Peterson says. It's like, it is the unveiling of that which has been covered and hidden. So although I've got the aroma of it, I haven't actually seen what's going on inside. And that's what an apocalypse is, which is a lovely way of putting it. So that would be another image. So unveiling a crock pot or a slow cooker and peeling back a curtain. That's what I mean by apocalypse. And obviously in the first century, it was a particular way of writing that was very symbol-laden in Judaism to try and explain often exactly this kind of thing. Heavenly realities, you often have angels, you often have visions. Daniel, Ezekiel, that kind of thing. Any others? Any other kind of clarifications? Yeah. Sorry, doxology means speaking forth in worship. So a doxology would be a classic biblical expression of praise. And some of us would finish sometimes our meetings with a doxology. And there's some very famous ones like, in the name of the Father, and all glory be to the Father and to the Son and to the Holy Spirit. Those sorts of things. But this one is like just a bursting forth in praise. Yeah, good shout. Doxa is the word for glory, so it means words about glory. The origin of the word preterist, I don't know. I mean, I don't know, but it relates to the description of the reading of any New Testament book, not just Revelation, as if it is referring to the events that are taking place in the lifetime of the hearers. That's what it's about. I don't know where the English word comes from. I don't know, actually. Any others? Okay, great. Next one. This, in some ways, is the most important page in the notes. Because this is the whole book in one page, as I am reading it. And so this is we'll just spend a minute on this to try and get the sort of structure. And I should say here, I've been helped by a lot of books. I've made reference to several already. The one that in some ways I found the most helpful at giving me the arc of the entire book is Peter Lighthart's commentary on Revelation, which I think is exceptional. It is also, however, very expensive. But I'll just throw that out there. But it's brilliant, and I thought it was worth every penny. But I would say that. This is an overview of the whole book in the 4-vision structure that I described. Okay, so we are over here on the left. We have vision number 1 is the vision to John that came to John in Patmos. I was, do you remember I said, in the Spirit? That's the way, that's the clue. I was in the Spirit and I saw this. Vision number 1. So vision number 1 for John takes the first 3 chapters. I was in the Spirit on the Lord's Day, and it comprises a vision of Jesus in chapter 1, which we've already read at the start of the day and we've referred to. Vision of Jesus, and then 7 letters or 7 messages to the churches. And this, in some ways, this is a bit of revelation that lulls you into a sense of full security. I understand all of this. It's fine. He's just speaking to this church and speaking to this church. You know, you've forsaken your first love. I'm knocking at the door. It's all very nice, and it makes you think, I'm going to get this book, and then bang, we get there anyway. But that's 7 letters. So, and actually, the vision of Jesus is 7-fold as well. There'll be a lot of 7s today. So we're going to be in the vision of Jesus. You have a 7-fold vision of Jesus. It describes 7 features of him, as we'll see. And then there are 7 letters. And if you then go down to the bottom of the table, this is an unveiling or an apocalypse of Jesus himself. That's really what's going on in chapters 1 to 3. The person of Jesus is being unveiled for us to see. Vision 2 is the longest one and the most difficult one. It's the one that gets all the strange YouTube channels. Is the one they set up camp here, right? This is what, then the letters also, we like the letters with the vision at the end, but the bit where most of the yelling takes place is in the middle, right? This vision 2. But this is a vision where actually John is not in the Spirit in Patmos, he's in the Spirit in heaven. That's what he says he is doing. So once I was in the Spirit, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. So this is, obviously he's not physically in heaven, but that's where the vision, and that's where the Spirit is effectively taking him, and that's where it's taking place. And so this is description of being in the Spirit in heaven. And this comprises, again, an introductory section which is running sort of vertically, the vision of the heavenly throne room, which is the passage that we probably know very well. Many of us, that'll be our favourite part of Revelation, maybe our favourite part of the Bible, the vision of the Lord, the one seated on the throne, and then the Lamb who comes and receives worship along with him. And so that beautiful passage there, that was probably, I would say, my guess in this room would be pretty familiar compared to much of the book. And then you have another 4 7s. You have 7 seals, 7 trumpets. You have 7 visions, which are less well known because they're not described using the same kind of practical image. So you know what a seal is, you know what a trumpet is, you know what a bowl is. The 7 visions don't work like that. The 7 visions are, and I saw, and then but he does that 7 times to telegraph for us we've got 7 visions in a row. And then the 7 bowls. And what I've done, and we're not going to go through all of these now, but it's like a grid, but that's what the 7 seals, trumpets, visions, and bowls are of. So and some of them might only last a verse or 2. I saw a white horse, and his rider was doing this. Some of them lasted an entire chapter. And then I saw a woman, a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with 12 stars around her head, and then a dragon tried to eat her. And blah, blah, blah. So some of them are quite small, some are quite long. But that's the shape of the middle. And the shape is important because it helps you find your feet where you are. And so probably as the day goes on, we will come back to this page occasionally. So Justin, it might be worth bookmarking or whatever you do, just to kind of find out this is where we are in the overall shape. So vision number 1, we've got a 7-fold vision of Jesus and 7 letters. Then the heavenly throne room. Then we have 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 visions, and 7 bowls. And if you look down at the bottom, it then says, God's throne unveiled. This is really not so much an unveiling of the person of Jesus as such. This is an unveiling of the heavenly sovereignty and dominion over all things that is true of God and the Lamb across all of history. That's what's being unveiled, if you like, in the second vision, which is, as I say, much the longest one. Vision number 3 which many of us probably would run chapter 16 right the way through to chapter 19, maybe. That's often how we might be inclined to read it. But John, I would argue, doesn't do that. He then says, then he carried me away in the Spirit to a wilderness. And he gets, effectively, it's a new visionary setting for him. And that's why I think this is almost vision number 3, chapter 17 to chapter 21 and then verse 8 or verse 9. He carried me away in the Spirit. And then we have the story, if you like, of the overthrow of Babylon, which we will come to. And then you have the 7 visions of the wilderness visions. The vision, again, these are marked out in the text. It doesn't say, then I saw vision number 1 was a horse. What he does is he says, and I saw a white horse, and I saw a great supper, I saw a victory, I saw, and so on. He effectively gives you those 7 with verbal markers in the text that each paragraph begins, and I saw, or behold, I saw. And that is the unveiling, if you go down to the very bottom, the unveiling of the harlot of Babylon. It's peeling back the veil on a number of things, but mainly this section is about the overthrow and the destruction of the harlot, the prostitute who is opposed to God's people, the prostitute riding the beast. And obviously we will get into who that is, and I'm not going to give you like a personal name, and it actually turns out to be more, no, that would be kind of weird. But as in we're going to get into the detail of who might that be and who I think it is and how other interpreters read it. But that's very important to John's purpose in the letter as a whole. And a big part of the comfort that comes to the readers is this great enemy, or these great enemies who are trying to destroy you with all their being, they are going to be thrown down, and soon. And, of course, if you read the book the way I do, you'd say, and they have been. And that serves as a symbol for the ultimate victory of God over all of his enemies. But we'll come to that. And then finally, the 4th vision, which I know you have to kind of tilt your head to see, but is the vision on the great mountain. He carried me away in the Spirit to a great high mountain. And this is the mountain is, again, the final vision. And this really is a vision, in many ways, of the church. And we'll come to that. I think people can misunderstand the end of Revelation when they think it is simply, obviously it is talking about the future glory of the cosmos renewed, but it isn't just doing that. It's actually describing the future, and I would argue the present glory, from one degree of glory to another, of the church. And we will come to that. And that is really an unveiling of the bride. So we have 4 visions, 4 great unveilings, and 7 sevens. So it's an intricate book, right? And you probably, sometimes nerds like me get up in front of rooms of ordinary people and nerds like you. I'm sure there's plenty of nerds in the room. I know some of them. And you go, well, there's this interesting structure. It's all very elaborate. And a lot of ordinary people just listen and they go, really? Did he really mean all of that? I think Revelation is one of those books where it's quite easy to see, yes, he did. Like, there's clearly that 7, that 7, that 7, that 7. They're all by design. Now, you might not agree with all of the judgments I make today. That's fine. But the idea that this is very, very carefully, literarily structured, I think people could argue the toss about how much that's true in Romans if they wanted to. They'd have to beat me in an argument over it, but I can see that it's true, right? I can see, wow, does it matter? Revelation's like, it really does. Like, there are 4 visions here. There's each arranged in 7s, and actually those 7s echo the days of the week, and they echo the plagues of the Exodus, and they have all kinds of different things going on. So we will come to that and hopefully see that as we go. And I think just a little tiny footnote at the bottom, just for those who, if you go, I associate with the word nerd. I don't like the idea that you're using it as an insult. I'm a nerd, I'm proud of it. Amen, brother or sister. Have a look at the little note at the bottom. John's visions go chronologically backwards through Israel's history. So he starts with exile on Patmos, then goes to the temple, the throne room of God in temple imagery with a sort of courts and crowds of angels and bowls of water and all the symbols of the temple and altars. Then goes to the wilderness and then goes to the mountain and the garden city. Now, of course, the Old Testament story is the exact opposite. The Old Testament starts on the mountain and the garden city and then moves to the wilderness and then moves to the temple and then goes to the exile. So John has flipped Israel's story backwards in a way, or is deliberately telling this in a way to culminate at the beginning, almost as if the history of the world, which of course it is in many ways, is a giant, well, I was going to say parabola, but I thought I'd get in trouble with people for using unnecessary mathematical jargon. So let's call it a U-bend, but then it makes it sound like a part of a toilet. But the history of the world is going down into this and into the depths of exile and then up again into new creation. And actually, if anything, And I would say the new creation is not just restored Eden, it's far better than, because Eden's now filled the entire world. So it's like a J curve in a way. And I think that's one of the things that John is doing by shaping his book this way. Starts in exile, finishes in the garden city on the mountain. So, take it or leave it. I'll have to say that a lot, but that's my take. Any clarifying questions on this so far? So we haven't yet got into the details, but yes, sir.
Yeah, at the beginning, you said you held to the first two things, and you sort of played down really the sort of prophetic, futuristic elements of Revelation. But surely, if we're looking for the culmination of the ages, there's a certain amount of that in it. Isn't it a question of somewhere there's all four woven?
Yeah, good question. So I said at the beginning you said you hold to the preterist idealist and played down the futurist historicist. And you also said I played down the prophetic, which I definitely don't want to do. I don't think prophecy and futurism are the same thing. So I think this is in fact, most prophetic, as you know, like most prophecies in the Bible are not telling the future at all. No. I know. I'm riffing off it because I think it's a point worth making. It's a very prophetic book, but that doesn't mean it's primarily concerned with things that are thousands of years in the future. So you're right. I personally read it. I think there is much less of that than we typically think. And in fact, I think there's almost, at the historicist reading, I think there's none of it, personally. I don't think that is included, except insofar as it's related to the idealist reading. So I don't think the French Revolution is anywhere in Revelation, except to say that there are pagan empires that try and suppress the church and they try and kill lots of Christians. But that's an idealist take rather than... So I don't think it's sequenced like that. Futurist, I agree more. I think there is some futurism in there because obviously the ultimate destination of Revelation is a new heavens and a new earth, which is clearly in the future, and the coming of Christ to rule. So I'm certainly not saying there is no futurism in it, but I probably, behind my saying I accent these two, is that most of the time when people come to the book of Revelation, in my experience, it's the second vision, the bit in the middle, that they are going, how do we read this? And that's the point at which I say, I don't think those events in vision number 2 are future. I mean, they are in a short way in the future for the readers, but for us, most of them are a long way in the past, I think. And in many ways, I'm saying that not to prove that I'm not necessarily right, but you have to take a view on it. Because obviously, if you think that the trumpets are events of the first century, you'll read it very differently than if you think they are things that will happen in the 25th century, just before Jesus returns or whatever. So that's why I've said it. But I'm really glad for that question. So the historicist thing, I'm like, I just don't go there. The futurist thing, definitely do, but mostly towards the end of the book. Does that help? Yeah. So yeah, good, very good clarifying question. Thank you. Any others?
Andrew, do you think John kind of quite cleverly created this structure of 777? Or was he just writing in the Spirit, and it was the Spirit who created the structure?
Yes. I actually think there's quite an important thing there about, it's a kind of jokey answer, which I've used before, but I do think it's a good question and an important principle, I think. I'm going to say something really pretentious, okay? So you just got to give me a bit of space, right? I write books. And sometimes when I am writing, I feel like what is happening in the book is happening to me rather than being something I have decided. I'm at this point in a project at the moment where I'm like, I'm almost keen to know what happens next. And lots of people who write, it sounds so pretentious, but lots of people who write say something similar. And I think what they are reflecting is when they do is, I don't mean inspiration, divine, infallible inspiration, but the idea, artistic inspiration. Some of us musicians or artists, you go, yeah, I kind of know what that is. I've started this thing, I don't know where it's going. And I think that reflects the both and that's involved in any form of creativity. And it's certainly true of divinely inspired books. Because I think John is definitely, I don't think he just sat down one day and go, I don't know where this is going, and it just randomly turned into all of these 7s and 4s. I don't believe that for a moment. This is incredibly artfully constructed. He's very aware of a lot of it. It took immense care and accuracy, but it is also, that very structure has been divinely inspired and revealed to him. And I think that's true of all of the Bible. And so I have generally quite a high view of the intentionality of the biblical authors, and a very high view of, obviously, divine inspiration, because I think sometimes people act like Isaiah just woke up one day and just went, I'm just going to speak, sing, O barren woman, break forth. You think, and it all just came out in this beautiful poetry. I'm like, I don't think that's true. I think, obviously I can't prove he didn't, but I think generally art like that takes a lot of attention and work. And at its worst, if we say it's all just spirit-given spontaneous, it can basically be an excuse for people saying, maybe the same thing will happen in my next sermon. I don't need to do any preparation or planning. Just stand up and speak it. It'll come out and say, yeah, you didn't sound as good as Isaiah. I don't know how to tell you. And I actually think at its worst, it can be a bit of an it can play down the importance of work, creativity, study, diligence, practice, those sorts of skills in the name of everything is just spontaneously brilliant, which I think some of us have through enough spontaneous ministry to know that's not always doesn't come out brilliantly. So there's probably some. I just think John is very aware of a lot of this stuff. I suspect he also says more than he knows a whole bunch of the time. Ultimately, I think there are always two authors in every passage of Scripture, the Spirit, God and the Spirit. And this is how Jesus talks about it, isn't it? David, by the Spirit, said, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. So that's Jesus' model. And I think that is what John is doing too. Great question. Okay, let's throw out an acronym, right? So letters to help us remember something. Next page. 6 things that might be undervalued in our reading of Revelation this is like revealing Revelation. So Reveal. 6 things that are taking place in this book that might be underrepresented in the way some of us would be inclined to read it. Okay? So one of them is, this is a romance. Revelation is a romance. It is a story in which we meet the male at the very beginning, and we don't really meet the woman of his dreams until the very end. Right? That's one of the things Revelation is. In fact, you could go deeper than that. You could say, this is a story in which you meet the male, and then you meet the false female, the woman who he doesn't want to marry, the prostitute, the harlot. And then, after that, you meet the bride of his dreams, the church. But that, in a way, is the plot of what's happening in Revelation. And his glory is completed by her glory, which is what is true, what Paul says of Adam and Eve. I said, the woman is the glory of the man. And actually, the man is glorified as his wife is glorified and beautified. That's what weddings celebrate in many ways. Now, I know in our culture, probably the bride often buys the dress and the husband hasn't even seen it. But the idea that the husband beautifies the wife and then presents her to the world is obviously a very biblical idea. And that, in many ways, is what Revelation is. So you meet the man in all of his glory in chapter 1. You don't meet the bride in all of her glory until chapter 21. And in between, you meet the false lover who is trying to break up the marriage, which is just a way of thinking. So you go from Christ via the harlot to the church. So that is, if you look, you might all go, I know that. And others you might go, I've never thought about Revelation like that. But that is a way of just have that in mind as you read it. You'll see, oh, there's all sorts of things. And we'll come back to that in later. The same thing happens in John's Gospel. We'll come to that. But where you meet, that Jesus is revealed very early, and then you meet women that he's not going to marry as the book goes on, and then eventually you meet the bride. And I think the same's happening here. Second thing you can read Revelation as an exodus. This is the exodus imagery is everywhere, and that Revelation is an exodus. It is a bringing of the plagues upon those who are oppressing God's people. God's people are enslaved. Plagues of judgment come upon the oppressors. The people of God are saved by the Lamb, which I'm just as a theme we would be very familiar with. The martyrs are then freed into the heavenly promised land via a journey through a wilderness. It's the Exodus story. There are plagues, frogs, boils, insects, hail, rivers of blood, locusts, the death of livestock, darkness. It is absolutely dripping with Exodus imagery, this book. Now, it's to tell us this is an Exodus story. The story of the people of God in the present age is an Exodus journey. Third way you can read it as a victory, but not the victory of who you think. Because I've heard lots of people say this over the years. Like, the message of Revelation is, Jesus wins. And everybody goes, hey. And you might have said it yourself, and I think I probably have. So I'm not dunking on anyone here. Not Duncan either. I'm not dunking, as in donut, on anybody. But that's actually not what Revelation is trying to tell us. It's almost like this is a battle between Jesus and darkness, and at the end, Jesus wins. That's not the plot. That's not the plot of Revelation. The message of Revelation, this is Peter Lightheart, the message of Revelation is not Jesus wins. When Revelation begins, Jesus has already won. And in fact, we've already read that. Right? At the very beginning, there's no debate about the win. He's already glorified. He's already received the kingdom. The message of Revelation is we win by faithful witness and song, and in triumphing through Jesus, we receive the kingdom. That's what's in debate as Revelation opens. There's no debate at all about whether Jesus will win at the very start. He is the conqueror, the Almighty. You can't call someone the Almighty and then go, I wonder if he's going to win. He's Almighty. What are you talking about? The question is, are the church going to win? And that's what Revelation is about. So it's the victory, but the victory of us is in some ways, that the victory of Jesus, of course, is there. It's just assumed from the start. The plot, the narrative is driven by whether or not the church will overcome and the victory of the church. And the ones who will receive these inheritances and so on. Colin.
Given that, does that make Daniel chapter 7 the best antecedent in the Old Testament and all other literature?
Yes.
Given, yeah.
I think that's a very good question. Does that mean that Daniel 7 and the visions of Daniel in general, but particularly Daniel 2 and 7, the best sort of, if you wanted to read an Old Testament passage to prepare you for Revelation, I think that's yes. I can't think of a better one. I think the only other one I think is probably the Exodus story to rival it in terms of how much of a shadow over Revelation it casts. And yeah, I think that's a great shout. Fourth, exile. So the book is a story of an exile, which kicks in, as you might expect, later in the story. Obviously, John is himself exiled as the book begins, but the people of God are exiled, if you like, after the Song of Moses in chapter 15. The Exodus imagery begins to dial down, and instead of thinking about the people of God being liberated from oppression into a wilderness with hail and frogs and boils and insects and all of those things, which is much of the book until this point, from chapter 15 onwards, we begin to get the rise of Babylon, and the story of Israel's exile in Babylon becomes predominant from chapter 15 or 16 onwards. So God then brings his people out of exile in Babylon back into a new city, a new Jerusalem, which is where the book ends. So that's another way of looking at the story. Fifth one, as an apocalypse, though written in a particular context, it exposes the patterns of worldly empire and divine justice. And therefore, I think, this is back to the question that you asked me a few moments ago, I think you could have your preacher's cake and eat your idealist one. Right, so this is the way Boris Johnson would read the book. I'm sure, like, that's cakeism, right? I want this one and this one. I want to believe in the symbolic. I want to believe in the timeless. But I also want to read it as if it's written to specific people in the first century who would understand. Sextus the slave knows what it means. And I think you can do that when you see it is an apocalypse. And therefore, even if you say, as I would, I think the mark of the beast is definitely Nero. I have pretty much no doubt about that. I don't think it's barcodes, I don't think it's Trump, I don't think it's anything. I think it's Nero, and I think there's lots of very good reasons why, and I think almost all scholars think it is. But I think you can say that and still say, but bestial rulers all the way through church history are just like that in all kinds of ways. And I can read Revelation 13 and say, well, it is about Nero, but my goodness, a lot of that sounds very like Genghis Khan. Or my goodness, a lot of that sounds just like the British in the 19th century. Certainly if you're, or the 18th century. Or a lot of that sounds just like Vladimir Putin or whatever. You can do Mao. In other words, I think you can have your cake and eat it with those too, because I think you're saying Sextus is not reading this thinking, there'll be a Russian ruler called Vladimir in 1900 years' time. But we, knowing that there is, would then go, but there's something quite deep here about the structure of evil in its opposition to the church, and as we'll see when we get there, about the way in which political power often tries to ally itself with religious power to crush the church. That's a thing, and it's not just a thing in the first century. So I think you can have your cake and eat it when you read it as an apocalypse, like unveiling the way reality works. And then finally, you think of, oh no, my arrows have turned into squares. I don't know quite why. Now you just think, what's he put all those squares for? But in my notes, they look like arrows. But you also read Revelation as a liturgy, which again might be, I'm guessing about our context here, most of us. Some of us come from churches in which liturgy is more something we talk about and understand. Some of us are just like, it's not really a word, it sounds a dusty word to me, but I'm a big fan, and I think we all have them and they might as well be good. And the Revelation actually provides us really with a pretty elaborate liturgy. It begins with a call to worship. There is a doxology, back to the word, an expression birthing forth in praise to Father, Son, and Spirit. There are epistles, letters, so you read the letters. There is praise in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. There is a reading from a scroll in which the gospel is then read and proclaimed. There is prophetic preaching of that scroll. There are bowls of wine in the form of like communion. There is a wedding feast. There is a blessing. There is a commission. And there is a prayer. You could model, and many churches do, model their liturgy on those elements and those elements alone, and you would have a comprehensive, cover all bases Christian form of liturgy that would entirely echo the book of Revelation. You might need to explain a few things and say, well, probably just slightly fewer trumpets and that sort of thing. But do you see what I mean? Actually, the book has the shape of a worship service. And you might say, well, our worship service doesn't have all of those elements in it. And I know it may well not. But actually, that is a pretty thorough, comprehensive Christian form of worship. I just think that's another way of reading Revelation as what it is. I'm not saying it's its primary purpose, but I think it's a lovely benefit of reading the book that way. Anybody want to ask any questions on that page? I've covered in a very brief outline quite a lot of ideas there, so just anyone want to come back at me on anything like that? Yes, sir.
For those in the first century, do you think this letter just read and heard would have been more accessible than it is to us? Or do you think it was...
Good, very good question.
It always has demanded careful reading, listening, thinking.
Oh, that's a great question. Would this, as a letter, would it have been more accessible to them than it is to us? Or has it always required careful exposition to be able to understand it? I'm really sorry, I'm going to say it again. Yes. I think both of those things are true. I think it definitely would be more accessible. There are a whole bunch of symbols, particularly to a biblically literate person in the first century, would have had less difficulty making a lot of the connections in this book, simply because a lot of them are more common cultural reference points for them, and they're familiar with who a lot of these rulers are. And I think that's true of the New Testament as a whole. There are lots of references to, when it says, for instance, let the reader understand, or this person needs discernment because it's man number. You and I don't live in we don't speak Greek, we don't speak Hebrew, we don't play games like gematria, where you add up the value of the letters and they turn into a number and everybody goes, oh, I don't think we do. I mean, I'm certainly not, it's like we play Sudoku, but that doesn't help. And therefore there's lots of reference points that chime with a kind of knowledgeable first century person, certainly one who was literate in the scriptures, that would not chime with us. But I don't think Sextus is going to pick this up and go, I understand it all. In fact, I don't think he's meant to. I think there's a lot of it. It says, John's constantly saying, they need discernment, they need understanding. And I think there's an invitation even then to go, you need to dig deep here. You need to think, what might he mean? And then some of them would be things where you hold on and you treasure the question until something happens in the world and you go, oh, this is what it promised. So I think they would understand it better than we do on first reading, probably, because of a number of reference points they would be familiar with, but not all at all. And I think, and the Bible's always had teachers. That's why we have teachers. It's why they had priests in Israel. So they're going to have to teach the law and they're going to have to explain it, because not everyone will immediately know all the things it means. And that's great. So yeah, great question. That's really helpful. Yes, sir.
Do we have a sense of where John, I enjoyed what you said about the mix of the Holy Spirit and his ability or his work. Do we have a sense of where he would have got that ability from in his background? I mean, obviously he's written another couple of letters, but, that wasn't his, you wouldn't think that was his foremost...
What's that?
His ability to write this.
Yeah, how did...
Even with the Holy Spirit
Yeah. Where does John get the ability to write? Well, it's basically exactly what they say of the apostles in Acts, isn't it? Where did they get the right to do all of this stuff? Like, I don't understand. I haven't been to university. What are you talking about? Like, they're just these oiks. And I'm not trying to cast you in the role of the Pharisee or the chief priest. But I think there is meant to be something of that shock. I think, oh gosh, there's a Volvo. You're blocking in a minibus, sorry. I think they get it from Jesus. I know it sounds so stupid, but I think, you know the sort of reverent silence that the Gospels preserve about what he really talks about in the 40 days between the resurrection and his ascension. And all we know is he spoke to them about the kingdom of God. And then we occasionally then he took them through a Bible study about showing how everything in the law, the prophets, and the writings pointed to him. And you're like, I'd love to. Could we just have a bit more on that? But I think in many ways that is what the New Testament is. I think the New Testament is the fruit of that. And I think by the time you read John's Gospel, obviously, again, we can read John's Gospel It's a great book to give to someone who's never read anything, right? Not even a believer. It's how J. John came to faith. Someone said, read this. If you don't, I won't talk to you. And walked off. And J. John read it twice in one evening, and that's how he got converted. So you can read John's gospel from nothing and understand it, but it's Augustine's wonderful quote, isn't it? The Bible is a lake or a river that is shallow enough for an infant to paddle and deep enough for an elephant to swim. And then what happens is as you read John's gospel, you're like, oh my goodness. John, if anything, is more artfully structured than this. It's astounding. But you wouldn't, but first time through, you go, no, it's just telling the story of Jesus. Went to a wedding, healed a random person, spoke to a woman. What's not to like? You know, it's very simple, but then you get into whoa, the level of theological rigor here. And he's also writing it sort of, well, at the very least, 30 to 35 years after Jesus has died and been raised. You can learn a lot of theology in 35 years if you've had Jesus as your tutor for 3 years, I would think. So, yeah, that would be at a physical level, that's how I might explain it. Yes, ma'am.
So I just wanted to ask, so you said that you feel like the mark of the beast is Nero.
Yeah, we'll come to this later. But were you going to ask about that?
Just about how, if we're looking at how politics are affecting people now, how you
Yeah.
look at the combination in terms of religion,
Yeah.
things that are happening all around the world, including how there's ideas of Tower of Babel popping up in certain places.
Yeah.
And just this influx that we seem to be having everywhere in terms of revival that's going on everywhere, people getting pulled
Yeah,
out
very
of
good.
spirits and more people with gifts that are rising up in our churches and in our communities, and God calling watchmen coming up around us in all different places, all different
Yeah.
around the world actually. Do you feel like it would be applicable in
Yeah, great question. So if you threw out there that you think the mark of the beast is Nero, but to what degree do you think that you can also read the events of these chapters as if they're referring to the kind of realities now? I absolutely do. And in many ways, that's the reason I mention it is because I'm trying to I probably didn't make it very well. But when I say you can have your preterist cake and eat your idealist one, that's exactly what I mean, is what you're saying. Which is, I think you can read it and go, in its original context, this is how it would be understood. This is who John was referring to. But that is not the only time that world rulers have ended up exercising power in that way. And world rulers, in an almost repetitively boring way, always do the same kind of thing with their power. And when they're trying to crush the church, they always try the same few tricks. And the church has to try the same few tricks in resistance. They have to pray. They have to read the word. They have to be unashamed of their testimony. They have to suffer to death sometimes. Those patterns are built into reality, not just the first century. So I think you can read it as a first century context thing and then also go, but that is very similar, because there are lots of similarities, as you rightly say, between Americans here, but Donald Trump and Genghis Khan, or Constantine and, I don't know, the French revolutionaries. You know what I mean? Like Robespierre. You can see odd similarities between all kinds of things when you read history. It's more a push against the idea of saying this figure would not have been, it didn't have any historical reference until many, many centuries later when we realized it was him. And I think what we generally do like that is every generation of the church reads the symbols as if they primarily apply to their own day. And I think what we have to do is go, no, they primarily apply in this setting. But within that is a series of realities and heavenly realities that are constantly at work in every generation, coming back like a boomerang. And so every generation can be edified, even though we know that its context was originally this. That's the way I read it anyway. And by the end of today, you may be a bit more persuaded of it. You may be even less persuaded of it, in which case, that's fine. We're all here to have fun. So, great question. Next page. We've got two more, and then we'll break. So, I mentioned just now about John's Gospel. This is a way of thinking about the plot of Revelation as if Revelation is... So here's a sentence for you. Revelation is to John as Acts is to Luke. Discuss, you could say, right? So now, obviously, discuss is slightly unfair because I've then put why I think it is true on here. And so obviously you might go, well, I haven't read it yet, but it sounds stupid to me. You're welcome to do that. But I think that there is, obviously, it is a totally different kind of book to Acts. But I think that in many ways it is doing something very similar, which is to narrate what happens next, but to narrate what happens next in a totally different mode to the way the book of Acts does it. Because obviously people always say, why is Luke the only one who wrote a sequel? I was like, well, maybe he didn't. Maybe he isn't the only one who wrote a sequel. Maybe John did as well. Now, this is controversial, right? This will be one of those things where I have to say, hold it lightly. There's some people who don't think that Revelation is written by the same guy who wrote John. I can't possibly get next to that idea personally, but I should say that that is something a lot of people say. And I think that there is an intentionality. So let me walk through it, right? So in John, in the beginning was the Word. All things came into being by him. Light shines in the darkness. The Word tabernacled among us. Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. And John the Baptist is the key witness in a trial. The revelation of John, I'm the beginning and the end. I'm making all things new. This is so basically the beginning of John and the end of Revelation are like bookends. That's the claim. I'm the beginning and the end. I'm making all things new. The Lord gives light, so there's no night there. The tabernacle of God is with humans. There is no more curse because the throne of God and the Lamb is there. And John, only this time a different John, the seer, John the visionary of Revelation, is the key witness in a trial. So the very start of John's gospel, the very end of John's revelation are like bookends. Jesus and his disciples, if you then move back to the next bit of the sort of second act of John and the second to last act of Revelation, also like bookends. Jesus and his disciples invited to a wedding. Jesus makes wine. He says his hour hasn't yet come. John the Baptist rejoices because he hears the voice of the bridegroom. A promiscuous woman appears who is not the bride. That's the plot of John 2 to 4. It's also the plot in reverse of Revelation 17 to 20. All right? Blessed are those who are invited to the wedding. Jesus treads the winepress and makes wine as the hour of judgment has come. Jesus before said, my hour hasn't come, now it has. Rejoice, for the wedding has come. The Spirit and the bride say come, and a promiscuous woman appears who is not the bride. Again, I'm not saying the Samaritan woman of John 4 is the harlot. I'm saying that there is a very strong structural symmetry between the way John's gospel starts and the way Revelation ends, which suggests to me that he's done a deliberate, I was going to say another U-bend, but he's deliberately, or mountain-shaped, right? So this bit corresponds to that bit, that corresponds to that. Judgment upon the temple is enacted by stopping buying and selling in Jerusalem in chapter 2 of John. Judgment upon Babylon, which may or may not be Jerusalem, but we'll come back to that. Just leave that there as a sort of spoiler, is enacted stopping buying and selling. So there is a judgment upon the way in which people worship and trade in the house of God in Jerusalem. Judas controls the buying and selling and is referred to as destined for destruction. The beast controls buying and selling, destined for destruction. Again, not saying Judas is the beast, just saying that's how evil works. Empire judges Jesus from a throne towards the end of John, and Jesus judges empire from a throne at the end of Revelation. There'd be lots of other connections as well. But that's a kind of, I think there's intentionality there. I think that John's deliberately, particularly the beginning of the gospel and the end of Revelation, are deliberately talking to each other, and as I say, this sort of mountain-shaped structure. And again, you can take it or leave it, but I really like it. I think there's lots there, and I think it would help. I think it helps us, and it may have some payoff later, because as you then start reading through the seals and the trumpets, the case I will try and make is that the seals and the trumpets are describing the same kinds of events as the book of Acts, which is back to the conversation we were having earlier about whether or not this is related mostly to the very future. So I don't think it is. Now, I might not be able to persuade you of that, but if there's anything to this, it would back up that view, which is that John is actually telling the story of the church, and the church is suffering and witness in spite of tribulation at the hands of the Romans and the Jews, and he's doing that in exactly the same way as Luke does. Well, no, not exactly the same way, in a very different way, but he's telling the same story as Luke is telling, just with a very different literary form. Now, you're going to need a break to think about that, but just before you have fantastic beasts and where to find them. This is a grid to just say, here's the major symbolic characters in the book. Here's who they are, I think. And what I've done is I've given you two scholars who I found very helpful on this book, who read the book really quite differently, so tell you who they think they are. So you can see there is, on many of these, there's consensus, but on some there isn't, and I just wanted to reflect that in the way I put the table up. There are 7 names for the devil in Revelation. There's yet another 7. Wormwood, poisoner. Abaddon and Apollyon, both destroyer. Dragon, the devourer, the eater. So the serpent, who is the seducer. The Satan, the accuser. And the devil, who is the slanderer. And you could do a whole series of sermons if you want. I don't know why you'd want to do a 7-week series on the devil. You might. But if you did, the Revelation gives you a very rounded view of the enemy, right? And that's clearly Satan. I think everyone agrees that that's who that is. the cavalry invasion of the East, which I know we haven't got to yet, that could be read. That's not clear, I think. You could read that in political terms, that is what happens when the Parthians cross the Euphrates to attack Rome, or whatever. Or you could read it in angelic terms. It's angelic cavalry staging a reconquest of the land. That's one of the more obscure symbols. It's probably the most difficult chapter in the book, chapter 9, I think. The sea beast is Rome, I think, by, pretty much everyone would see the sea beast as Rome, and we'll see why when we get there. The land beast, the false prophet, well, you could read that as local pagan religion, which supports Rome through its temples and then gets destroyed, or you could see it as the Jewish priests and leaders who support Rome, persecute the church, and get destroyed. And your reading of the whole book will interact with your take on that. The scarlet beast in chapter 17 is Rome. I think everyone agrees. They're seated on 7 hills, clothed in scarlet and all that sort of stuff. The empire of the day. The mark of the beast, I think, is Nero, but again, we'll come to why later. The woman, in Ian Paul's reading, the woman is Israel, who gives birth to a male child and is protected from the dragon for 3.5 years in the wilderness. And I think everyone, again, not everyone, but nearly everyone goes, that's Israel. But Lightheart goes on and does this fascinating thing where he says, yeah, and then the woman appears 5 chapters later in somewhat different clothing, clothed as a harlot. That effectively the woman Israel has become allied with and now riding the beast, who is looking to try and destroy God's people. That's effectively, there was, and first century, you do get a Jewish Roman, the Jews and the Romans are both trying to destroy the church, and that's one of the things that may be going on here. But Israel has actually turned into Babylon in a horrible irony in the first century. And again, people will differ on whether that's true. And then the harlot, Egypt, Sodom, Babylon. So this is there where you get a division between these two readings, where Ian Paul goes, this is Rome, because it's the great city that has dominion, judged for immorality, sits on many waters and 7 hills, and has prospered through seafaring and trade. Lightheart's reading says this is Jerusalem, because it specifically says it's the city where the Lord was crucified. She's dressed as a priest. She's hated by the beast, and the beast is Rome, responsible for the blood of the saints and the prophets, and is eventually destroyed and burned, which is what happens to Jerusalem in AD 70. Again, you will need a break to think about this. So let's take one.